Welcome. This week you're supposed to read the intro and chapters 1 and 2 in the Rower book. Um, anyways, uh, today we're going to talk about ecosystem ecology. An ecosystem is the community of organisms in an area and the physical factors with which they interact. Oh, by the way, I want to add that these notes go along with those chapters, but they also go along with the assigned readings in your textbook. They tend to focus more on the textbook. Um, the uh, the Rower book is an interesting way of looking at um, the same information just from a specific standpoint by looking at coral reefs, which are in themselves very interesting. So, an ecosystem is a community of organisms in an area and the physical factors with which they interact. I actually am not crazy about the way that they start this section of notes. Um, I like to think of it. All right, so let's start with the animal. So we have an animal. That's an organism. What do we call a group of organisms? Well, those group of organisms that are the same species we call a population. So you can look at a population in terms of a small area or a really large area. Like, for example, the population of horses in Middlefield versus the population of horses in Ohio. Um, Again, it just depends on how you phrase that and frame the population. Understand that they interact, but at a different scale. Probably a better one would be like the population of deer in Geauga County versus the state of Ohio. Deer don't follow county lines, but generally speaking, most of them within that area within a county are interbreeding. Sometimes it's even within areas of the county where you have segments of the forest segmented off. Those are different populations. You could talk about one specific herd of deer. Um, so that's your population. And they have some interactions amongst themselves, like, for example, who's the dominant male, who are the young males, who are the females, so on and so forth. And within different animal populations, there's different roles amongst the males, females, and the offspring. Um, uh, Again, though, there's different dynamics dependent on the species, and so that's important to look at. But then the next thing we need to look at is what's called a community. So you build up. So you have a population that's one specific animal. So what are some other animals that interact with deer within in Geauga? And you know, there have been bear within the state of Ohio. I'm not completely sure about Geauga. I'm pretty sure there's been a couple. Do they really take down deer? Are they really impacting it that much? I mean, yeah, they impact it in a way. What's something else that impacts? And a lot of students will say things like coyotes, and sure, that's fine. Do coyotes take down that many deer? I mean, coyotes are more scavengers. Yeah, they'll take down deer. Are they taking down a big percentage of them? What is the primary predator of the deer? Well, really, it's humans. So we have to figure into their ecosystem and their ecology. Now, one mistake that a lot of students make, and I've kind of led you down this rabbit hole because this is the way that the discussion usually goes when we're in person, is that everyone mentions all the predators. Well, are deer interacting with just predators? I mean, we already mentioned the horse of Geauga County, right? The horses. Do they interact with deer? How could they impact the deer population? Well, if the horses are taking up a field, the deer are not taking up that same space. They are eating the food that the deer could otherwise eat. That's competition. That is an interaction between those two populations. So we call those communities when we have one organism interacting with another. Now, another thing that we need to look at, the next step up. So first of all, we have the organisms. We have a population of organisms, and then the populations of different organisms interacting with each other. Don't forget plants, by the way, when we talk about populations. I mean, plant population is important, and that brings me to my next point. We need to look at the biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic means things that are living, and abiotic are things that are non-living. Are we going to have a lot of deer in a county if there's not much grazing land? And really, I mean, the answer is no. I mean, if you have like a lot of feedlots, let's say like cattle that are just in feedlots where they have the land torn up, because they're way overcrowded. I'm not talking about like you drive by some farm and there's lots of grass and there's a few cattle scattered out. I'm talking like major upscale feedlots. We really don't have those in Geauga County. But let's just say, what if we did? Well, if those cattle are overcrowded, they're tearing up the grass. They aren't even eating the grass. They're just tearing it up because they're taking up the space. What are they eating? They're eating grain that's grown out of corn that's been shipped to them. Again, costing fossil fuels, costing time, costing money, actually. Um, and those cows are eating just the grain, no natural fed grass. And but they're taking up space and they're destroying the plant population. And what's going to happen to that deer population? And you can see how the interaction there isn't just of the cows, but also of the available land, which is abiotic, the grass, which is another organism that has a population that is biotic, and you can see how everything kind of interconnects there. And that's where we get to our ecosystem. It's not just the living things. You have to think about these physical factors, such as the amount of sunlight. If there's not enough sunlight, you're not going to have grass. I mean, deer don't live in deserts, right? So you need to have enough sunlight and enough rain, enough water. Um, you need to have enough actually rain to support a forest. Usually, deer are not grassland animals, although some populations are more adapted to that. And that's another thing is you'll see different populations more adapted to one environment or another. I believe we talked about this previously, how the deer of Wisconsin are much different than the deer of like Kansas, which are different than the deer of Ohio, even though they're all white-tailed deer. I mean, first of all, the size of them as you go further north is just so much larger. And part of that has to do with maintaining large body mass so that you can withstand the cold more. But also, like, what is your surrounding environment and abiotic factors? And they all go into impacting that and then selecting for specific traits within that population that make them more or less favorable. So ecosystem ecology emphasizes energy flow and chemical cycling among the various biotic and abiotic components. And we can see how this can be impacted. I mean, it happens a lot in Ohio. For example, the amount of fertilizer we put out in Ohio is gigantic. We put down a ton of fertilizer, and it's not just farming. I mean, a lot of people like to have nice lawns. Well, where does that fertilizer go? Eventually it washes into Lake Erie. And we've had major problems the last several years in Lake Erie of just having these gigantic algal blooms because they're just having so much fertilizer from the runoff running into the lake. And there's a lot of factors that can mitigate that runoff. I mean, first of all, what's causing the runoff? Why is the stuff flowing faster? The amount of grass slowing it down, the amount of trees, the amount of forest land all impacts that, but also how we have our drainage ditches and our sewers. I mean, just think about it. Which is going to have a better impact on filtering out a lot of the pollution? And pollution can be a beneficial thing. Like, for example, in this case, fertilizer is beneficial to plants, but it's harmful to the environment because there's too much of it, and it's going right straight to the lake. So which one's going to mitigate that flow more? A stream, a sewer, or a ditch? And really, the stream is going to slow everything down the most because it's going to have the most flora and fauna, just slowing down the flow of that water and allowing a lot of that fertilizer to be absorbed and utilized before it gets to the lake. We have a lot of sewers, though. They're just tubes that just run that water straight down. Even ditches really are artificial streams, but they don't have a lot of flora and fauna in there. There's not a lot of animals and plants that are slowing that down. It's still flowing relatively rapidly down towards the lake. And it also has to do with the amount of fertilizer we're putting into our environment. So one of the major determining factors of an ecosystem is the amount of sunlight that it gets. So imagine you have a flashlight and you're shining it straight down at the floor. You're going to have the smallest ring of light possible, and that's like the sun hitting directly overhead at the equinox, which is basically at the equator. Still pretty direct on all the way up to what we call the tropics. We have the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and it has to do with the astrological signs and what constellation you see at night when the sun is most directly over either of these. It shifts a little bit though because of the tilt of the Earth. Um, but still pretty direct sunlight all the way between these two tropics. Tropos is Latin for turn, and this is based on that angle of the Earth, which is at 23.5 degrees. So the Earth is tilted a little bit, and so during summer, this is more direct sunlight, and this is less direct sunlight. Now, just a point of fact, between these tropics, we're not going to have a great variety in the hours of sunlight. Costa Rica sits right about where this arrow is, right there. And at that point, in Costa Rica, so whenever I take a trip down there, students are always amazed that the number of hours of daylight are basically 12 hours. Sun comes up at 6, it goes down at 6. It's middle of summer and it's going up and down at 6. And that's because basically they have at most a 13-hour day and at least an 11-hour day. So they have less than an hour of fluctuation each way because of how close they are to the equator. They're at about, the lowest point in Costa Rica is about 9.5 degrees north latitude. So, they're not going to have as much of a variance in the amount of sunlight. It's pretty much 12 hours a day year round, a slight variance. Whereas when we go way up north here, like for example, right here, my arrow is on England. And if you've ever read Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, he talks about it being the sun going down, and I can't remember the exact time. It's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon or something, and the sun's already down. That's because they're really, really north compared to us, and so they have a bigger variance on the number of hours of sunlight and nighttime. So in the winter, they really have, they get down to like 6 hours or so of sunlight, but in the summer they have over 18 hours of sunlight. So now, the amount of sunlight affects the amount of plant because it's the amount of time that you photosynthesize. All right, so the number of hours of sunlight actually is equal wherever you are on the Earth. It's just some days you have the higher end and some days you have the lower end, depending which way you're tilted to or away. But when you're at the equator in between these tropics, you get the most direct sunlight because it's kind of like shining a light straight down. If you take that same flashlight that's shining straight down, that same beam of light, and you angle it out at like 20, 30 feet in front of you, the same amount of light photons are taking up a larger area. And so they're spread out. And you can see here how this bar of light is the same width as down here. But notice all the light is in this little circle versus up here, it's at a much larger angle. And that has to do with the angle of light. And so because of that, the intensity of light is less. And also notice it's traveling through more atmosphere here. And so that means that plants up here are basically getting less sunlight per square inch. It has nothing to do with the amount of time, even though the amount of time does change and it does impact growing season. Really year-round, the plants do get the same amount of sunlight in terms of hours. It's the intensity of that sunlight. Another thing about Costa Rica is we will be up in the mountains, and it will be between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit sometimes. And students will go around thinking that, hey, it's cool out. It's not that hot at all. And they'll walk with short sleeves or just not putting any sunblock on their face. But we're up in the mountains, so the air is thinner. But the other issue is just that we have more intense direct sunlight. And because of that, students get sunburned a lot in Costa Rica, even if they're up in the mountains where it feels really cool, because it's easy to think, hey, it's cool out, I'm not going to get sunburned. Even on cloudy days, you can get sunburned in Costa Rica because of how close it is to the equator. So, global air circulation and precipitation patterns, and this is something that impacts climates. We notice some patterns when we look at it as an overall globe. Water evaporates in the tropics, warm, wet air masses flow from the tropics towards the poles. So basically we have the most rain at the tropics, right? And as it moves towards the poles, we're going to lose a lot of that water dumping down, and we're going to have all those forests. And as you go further north, you're going to get less and less water to where eventually when you don't have enough water to support trees, you start to enter into some grasslands. And this is north of the tropics. And then it's going to continue to get dry until basically you get to a desert area. And then the pattern's going to start to switch around again because now you're going to have more evaporation and such. And you're going to go back to a grassland because you're starting to get more water, more precipitation. And then eventually a forest, which is basically the ecosystem that we live in. And as you move further north, it starts to get dry again. And if you get far enough north, you get to the tundra, which is basically a grassland. And then by the time you get to the poles, you end up with another desert because they don't get much precipitation. Yeah, they get snow, but there's not much readily available water, and really a lot of it's just frozen. Like it's just frozen and dry. So it's a desert again. And so even though the temperatures change, even though the amount of sunlight changes, we do follow this pattern where at the tropics we have lots of rain, forest. Move north, you start to get some grasslands. Move further north, you get deserts. Move further north, and actually you can do the exact opposite going the other direction from the equator, but we'll get to that in a second. Go further north and you get grasslands again. Go further north yet, you get forests, and then further north you get back to that grasslands and then desert at the pole. Exact same thing going south. Start at the south and you go down to the Tropic of Capricorn, you have rainforests. Go further south, you get grasslands. Go further a little bit further south and now you get some deserts, grasslands. Now you don't have too many southern forests, a little bit in Australia. And the reason that is because, well, there's just not land in the southern part of the earth where you would have the forests. And then grasslands again, not too much for tundra. And then again, now the desert at the South Pole. Now there are some major exceptions to this rule. One of them is that mountains get in the way. Mountains really mess with stuff. Another thing is the air currents. Remember, air currents, due to the Coriolis effect, rotate, and they rotate in opposite directions on the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, but they end up carrying that moisture around. Remember how I was talking about England having a much higher range in sunlight and nighttime than even we do in Ohio? Yet their climate is more similar to ours. They have a warmer climate, a more temperate climate than what you would expect. I mean, if you drew a line across the globe from England across the Atlantic Ocean, really you end up in Canada, and their climate is more similar to ours in Ohio than it is to Canada. Why? Because of the Gulf Stream. Basically, you have and it has to do with both the air coming off of that Gulf Stream, but also that warm water gets warmed up near the equator, near the coast of Florida, and then shoots across the Atlantic Ocean and brings warmer temperatures to England. So 4 major abiotic components of climate are temperature, talked about that, moving north to south, that does impact it. Precipitation, that is an even larger aspect because of that's going to determine your plant life. Same thing with sunlight. These two are the biggest ones, precipitation and sunlight. Temperature is important, but a lot of people think like deserts are all hot and dry. No, remember the poles are deserts. So temperature, you can have a desert even where it's really cold. There's actually a lot of deserts closer to the equator, and the reason they're deserts is because they're in high elevation where there's just not much precipitation getting there. So precipitation is the number one factor determining that ecosystem, and then sunlight is probably the second, and then next we have temperature and wind. I'd say put temperature ahead of wind. So we use the term biome. What is a biome? A biome is like an ecosystem. Ecosystems are more specific, whereas biomes are more general. Like grasslands are pretty general. There's a lot of different types of grasslands. If we talk about American prairies, they're a little bit more specific. You can even get more specific in terms of like elevation, whether it's a rolling prairie, whether it's a riverland prairie, a wetland prairie. I mean, there's a lot of different subcategories there. So macroclimates consist of patterns on the global, regional, and landscape level, and that's kind of what I was just talking about. Whereas microclimates consist of very fine patterns, such as those encountered by the community of organisms underneath a fallen log. So we're talking about very specific small areas. We can look really at a lot of things as being an ecosystem. Really, your body is an ecosystem based on the bacteria and other microorganisms that live on and in you. Biomes are major life zones characterized by vegetation types. So you got terrestrial biomes or physical environment, basically your aquatic biomes, and it has to do with like minerals and nutrients flowing. Climate is very important in determining why terrestrial biomes are found in certain areas. And again, climate is an overall big picture of the weather. You don't mention that the climate of Ohio is um, cold and snowy. Well, yeah, for part of the year, the climate is not that in mid-August. It's hot, sticky, almost feels tropical. Um, and again, it has to do with our proximity to the lake, to the Great Lake, our proximity really even to the Gulf of Mexico, because we do get a lot of weather because the jet stream carries some of that moisture up from the Gulf of Mexico. Also, our proximity to Canada. During the winter, that jet stream comes down out of Canada and comes across the lake and brings us snow. So our climates are overall big picture, like year-round weather, while rather than the weather is what's going on right now. I look outside right now and it's windy and rainy. All right, and I might add, as late as I believe April 15th, maybe even later, I want to say 1 year, it was April 25th, I have had snow days from school. So, just because it's mid 60s right now, really windy and been rainy all day, that is not our climate. That is just the weather outside today. So here we talk about, we can look at this graph and it talks about the mean precipitation. So this amount of rainfall, notice the importance there, but it also has to do with the amount of sunlight. Notice that, and temperature too. So here's your annual temperature. Notice that tropical rainforests have to be warm, but also they have a wide range of rain. And notice that even some coniferous forests, they get some rain, as much as some tropical rainforests in some places, like for example, the Pacific Northwest. But the temperature is much cooler down there. Notice that some deserts are really warm and some are pretty darn cold. Arctic and Alpine, and really some of these Arctic are really just another fancy name for a type of desert. Aquatic biomes are characterized by their physical environment, basically minerals in the water and such. They show less latitudinal variation than terrestrial biomes. So, in other words, I talked about how you start and you have rainforest, you have tropics, and you move north and you have grasslands, and then you move north. And you don't see that as much with the aquatic ones. It really has to do with proximity to land, the access to nutrients. Marine biomes have salt concentrations of about 3%. More than that, and you have basically like the Great Salt Lake or Dead Sea, where it's high salt and just there's not a lot of living things there other than microorganisms. The largest marine biome is made up of the oceans, which cover about 75% of the Earth's surface and have an enormous impact on the biosphere. So, important things here: photic zone and aphotic zone, that determines the amount of photosynthesizers. So, photic zone is your top 200 meters of the ocean. That's how deep sunlight can penetrate into the ocean. Anything below that, you don't have sunlight going down there, so you're not going to have as many photosynthesizers unless they're dead and dying. So in the lower levels, we call the aphotic zones because it receives less sunlight. The photic and aphotic zones make up what we call the pelagic zone. Now, deep in the aphotic zone lies what's known as the abyssal zone. And that's 2,000 to 6,000 meters. Basically, there's not a shred of sunlight making that deep. And you have some animals that are just adapted to being in the deep. By the way, what is the largest migration on Earth that occurs? Well, nightly, there are organisms that move from the aphotic zone up into the photic zone. Why do you think that they do that? Well, what's the base of any food chain? Your producer, something that's producing food, right? And so the things from the aphotic zone move up there to eat the things that are at the base of the food chain. The organic and inorganic sediment at the bottom of all the zones is known as the benthic zone. Benthos is anything that just kind of falls and is kind of rotting on the floor of the ocean, the floor of the forest, whatever it is. That's what benthos is. The communities of organisms in the benthic zone are collectively called benthos. Detritus are dead organic matter, falls from the productive surface of the water, an important source of food. And again, we also call it detritus on the forest floor when we talk about like leaf litter and such. So notice in some of the bigger lakes, like Lake Superior, and some of the other ones are even deeper than Lake Superior. And yes, there are lakes much deeper than Lake Superior. We have what we call a photic and an aphotic zone. We even have the benthic and pelagic zone. And we have this abyssal only in the ocean. Notice we have this continental shelf. And after the continental shelf, things really drop off. What is resilience? Resilience is the capacity for renewal. Basically, how fast are things cycling nutrients? And you can kind of think of this in terms of like rainforests, right? A lot of people think that rainforests are full of nutrients. And if you cut down all the trees in a rainforest and plant crops, you're going to get a year out of them, maybe, if even that. Rainforests have very little nutrients in the soil. Why? Well, the minute the leaves hit the ground, they rot, they disintegrate, and then that's it. And everything's growing so fast, it's sucking up all those nutrients super fast. That's renewal. Same thing happens in coral reefs. Basically, these organisms are recycling these nutrients really, really fast. Things are growing fast. They're digesting food. They're replacing things extremely fast. So class Anthozoa, if you remember, is a specific group of class Cnidaria. Cnidaria are the stinging animals. So when we look at this, they have radial symmetry, and that's as advanced as they get. They have multicellularity, they have tissues, and then that's it for those animals. And then they are the radiolarians, which means that they have radial symmetry. They're related to jellyfish. Now remember, both jellyfish and corals have both stages in their life cycle, what's known as the polyp. Corals pretty much just stay in polyps. I mean, we're not even going to address the medusa stage because in some of them, many of them, it's completely absent. And then you have the medusa stage, which is typically what we think of as our jellyfish. They have these stinging cells on their tentacles known as nematocysts. And if you've ever had a friend who was a prankster, and they have a large tube of Pringles, and they offer you one, and you open the lid, and a spring snake pops out, and they laugh at you. That's really a biological spring version of this right here in these nematocysts. Basically, you have this cell that's coiled, got this coil in it, and something triggers this, something like usually it's tactile, so something touches it, and this lid pops off, and it shoots this thread into the organism, and it's even got these little barbs to make sure it sticks. And then the cell pulsates, pumping in toxins. Now, these toxins can be anywhere from, well, not toxic at all. Some jellyfish and anemones have completely lost their ability to sting, but most retain some ability. One that I did an experiment with when I was in college, it was called a Pistia pallidea, and you could touch it, and you could pull your finger away from it, and you'd see the little thread sticking to your finger. Didn't penetrate your skin at all. Others, like for example box jellies, are extremely toxic, and you need an antidote, an antivenom ASAP, or you could pass away. So these are star corals right there. Notice the coloration in their tentacles. That's important coming up here. And that's because a lot of these guys have algae and other dinoflagellates in their cells. Like they have the cells, they acquire this dinoflagellate or algae, and it's going to live inside the cells, and basically it's producing nutrients, carbohydrates for the polyp, and the polyp in turn is producing some proteins and such for the algae. And they are symbiotic. And so basically the coral is going to grow, produce an exoskeleton, and it's going to spawn by releasing sperm and egg into water. They fuse, gain another symbiote, and then repeat the process. However, because of warmer temperatures in water, the algae the corals get stressed. The actual polyps get stressed. And when they get stressed because of that heat, they don't know what's wrong. Like something's wrong with them. They don't like it. And they don't want to be nice and friendly to this algae. By the way, they provide them with carbon dioxide. They provide them with a place to live. These guys are producing extra carbohydrates and food for them to basically survive. And so this wonderful relationship, symbiotic relationship known as mutualism, where they're both gaining a benefit, goes haywire. And the coral basically says something's wrong with me, I don't like it, and it's worried about itself. So it expels these algae. And so when they expel them, now they have less ability to get carbohydrates. They have less ability to get food, and eventually they die, and we end up with what's known as coral bleaching, where basically the corals turn white because they're missing all of their polyps. If you buy coral in a store, it is white, and the reason it's white is because it doesn't have the polyps on it. So until the 1970s, humans did not know that most of the life in the ocean is microbial. And see, that's the important thing here is that, we think of the corals, and if you just put the little anthozoans, the little polyps there, you think, hey, that's all we need. But it turns out that we need these algae to help fix carbon. We also need the bacteria. The bacteria is important too because it fixes nitrogen. It helps them basically make their proteins. Gathers phosphorus, again, important for making DNA, important for metabolism. Iron, metabolic waste. It helps get rid of some of the wastes. And if you've ever had a fish tank, you know that it's really important to have a good filter on that fish tank. Otherwise, the fish stop moving and start floating at the top of the water, usually upside down. And that's because their own waste is killing them. Because the bacteria, there's actually bacteria in the carbon filters that you use to filter the water. Like that flowing water is important because it takes water over that bacteria, and that bacteria breaks down the nitrogen wastes. I mean, just think about it. Where do fish pee? In the water. Would you want to swim around in your own pee? No, you want to get rid of that. It's toxic to you, right? And so the bacteria have to break down those nitrogen wastes. And so bacteria are extremely important. And our understanding of this is just beginning to build, really. I mean, we're in the infancy stages of understanding how these microbial relationships actually work in the ocean. So, really this coral it does everything. It's basically a hunter-gatherer farmer. It grows algae. It gathers those nutrients. It stings things and draws them into their mouth to eat. And so basically that zooxanthellae are a specific group of algae that live inside there, and they transfer 90% of their sugars to those corals. Notice the use of carbon dioxide and the use of making bicarbonate and using that to make their exoskeletons. That's another important thing that's going on in their little mini ecosystem. So here are some of the different groups of zooxanthellae, also known as dinoflagellates. Here's your basic photosynthesis equation. Notice the use of carbon dioxide in there. So I talked about this briefly, and we talk about community level interactions. Any type of interaction is known as a symbiotic relationship. And we divide them into these different types of categories. So think of species A, and it's either positive, neutral, or negative. And species B is either negative, neutral, or positive. And if both of them are gaining a benefit, like for example with our corals there, that's what we call mutualism. It's a specific type of symbiotic relationship. Not all symbiotic relationships are beneficial. One I don't see listed on this chart here is negative for one but positive for another. Now we can say it's predation when we think of terms of, like, for example, the coral stinging like a shrimp or something and drawing it into its mouth and digesting it. That's predation. We can think of like a coyote taking down a deer. Again, that's predation. But also parasitism, one gains benefit and the other is negative, and that is a type of symbiosis. Trust me that if you are the host, you are not happy about having a parasite. That's one benefit, one negative. Now, commensalism is where one gains a benefit and the other is kind of neutral. It's kind of like some of the fish that are living around the corals. Not the clownfish. The clownfish is different. That's mutualism. Both of them gain a benefit. Basically, the clownfish has a place to live, helps clean the corals, draws in other things that the corals can eat. and then the corals end up protecting the clownfish. I'm talking about just some of the fish, like what's called a triggerfish. They live around the corals. They don't harm the corals. They don't help the corals, but they're getting the benefit of having a place to hide from like sharks and such. That's commensalism. Amensalism is one doesn't really care that it's there, can or can't be, but it can harm the other one. It's kind of hard to think about that, but like it can be like a fish moving into the area, and it is kind of overcrowding the other one. It doesn't need to be in that area, but because it is, it's hurting the other one. Um, don't see that too much, and we don't talk about it too much. Neutralism neither gains a benefit. Like they're just both there. They don't care that they're there, and neither is harmed nor helped. Now, if both have a drawback, that's competition. And again, we already talked about this, like for example, the deer and the horses, right? Um, a good example of this a lot of times are introduced species where the new species isn't thriving as much, but they are pushing out another species, and both of those are in a negative type of competition. So introduced species a lot of times are amensalism, but they can be competition where both are kind of harmed. Sometimes you can have that issue, like for example, if we had both wolves and coyotes living in the same ecosystem, both are feeding off of the same types of organisms. Um, Probably again, still not the best example because of they do have slightly different niches. That's a role within the environment, but um, the sheep and horses and those guys with the deer, that's kind of a good example of competition. Stressors to corals: reduced or increased temperatures. Like they have a really small range of temperature that they like. By the way, this is what the healthy one looks like. This is bleached coral. But sometimes temperatures are going up because of global climate change. Sometimes they're going down depending on where you're at. I know a lot of people, they used to call it global warming. A lot of people stopped calling that because of, to be blunt about it, basically ignorance by some people. Um, and they'll say things like, "Oh, it's been a really cold winter. What's going on with global warming?" And understand the overall temperature of the globe is, as a whole, is going up. But there are some pockets that will have some cooler temperatures, short term or even slightly longer, because it's really just the climates are changing. Think about it this way: if I open up the fridge and stand next to it, is the temperature outside the fridge going to go down? Yes. But what's happening to the overall temperature? The temperature of the fridge is going up. And definitely outside of it, you can feel that it's going down, it's getting cooler, but that overall temperature of the fridge is going to go up. And really, that's what's happening. There's terms like what's called the Arctic fence, and that's more or less keeps the cold air where the cold is and the warm air where the warm is, and that's breaking down because of this global climate change. Increased solar radiation, and that was an issue for a while because of using a type of propellant in a lot of spray cans. Ocean acidification, again, increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in an environment, you increase the amount of dissolved carbon in water, and carbon in water turns into what's known as carbonic acid, which increases um, the amount of acidity, basically decreasing the pH, and it makes it harder to make this skeleton structure that they make. Increased sedimentation, again, more runoff can cause issues. Make the water murkier, make it so less sunlight's reaching the corals. Pathogen infections, different types of diseases. Sometimes the diseases are because they live in warmer water. Changes in salinity, the amount of salt flowing can change because the temperature of the water changes, so its ability to dissolve minerals changes. The amount of ocean currents can change directions a little bit based on something being warmer and colder. If you understand how convection currents work, warm air or water rises, cold air or water sinks, and that's a whole flowing. And if you either equalize or increase the difference in temperatures, you're going to change those patterns. Again, just pollutants in the water, things like mercury and such in water can cause them to be stressed. So here we can see sea surface pH, and so this is the change in pH as a result of climate change. Abiotic factors environment. We talked a little bit about this: the amount of sunlight, the amount of temperature, but a lot of the organic compounds, um, you know, rocks, soil, um, uh, the amount of water available. But even things like fire can be an impact. It's an abiotic factor. Biotic factors are living things. Here are some of the diseases that I had mentioned previously about their impacting the corals. Ciliates tend to be associated with these diseases. These are things that are closely related to animals. They're a type of protist that has cilia surrounding the surface. So we can see what happens here to the amount of carbon dioxide in the water and the amount of bicarbonate. And so basically 30% of the man-made carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean. So as the amount of man-made carbon dioxide goes up, dissolved inorganic carbon essentially is acidifying the ocean, and it's in even though the pH has only decreased by 0.1, that represents a 30% increase in hydrogen ions. And that's because bicarbonate is made, and that kind of buffers it, but it's got its limits. Once we get that pH over a certain level, it causes some major problems. So the pH increase is expected to be by 0.4 by the end of the century, so by the year 2100. That's a really big change in the pH. And can corals and a lot of sea life even survive with that? And it's a pretty big question. So the amount of carbon dioxide goes up, the amount of bicarbonate goes down, the pH goes down, because remember, a decrease in pH represents an increase in the acidity level, or hydrogen ions. And so basically we need those bicarbonate ions in the water in order to make the skeleton. So this is a carbonic acid. It neutralizes bicarbonate. It dissolves calcium. And all of these organisms use bicarbonate in their shells, exoskeletons, so on and so forth. So oceans are a carbon sink because they absorb more carbon than what they release. So they do give us some leeway on the amount of carbon that we're putting into the air. The problem is they do have a tipping point, and we need to be very cognizant of that tipping point. Like, how close can we get to that tipping point before we basically reach a point of no return? And that's kind of, a scary question, because once you reach that tipping point, it's too late. Like, there's no undoing it in the short term. You want to avoid getting to that tipping point. Okay, and that is everything for today.